So yeah, welcome everyone. I hope someone else just coming in. So this is a great turnout. I appreciate you coming out on a Sunday afternoon to this Nomas Projects event. And so my name's Cully, if people don't know. I'm an artist based in Dundee and one of the directors of a charity called Morphe Arts, and also one of the people behind Nomas Projects, along with Owen, that waved earlier. Hello, Owen, who is an artist and currently works in St Andrews for... Owen, I can't quite remember.
The Encyclopedia of Theology at the School of Divinity in University of St Andrews. So.
Yeah, it's a great project. For those that don't know, there's some people who may not know this. Nomas Projects is situated in Dundee. It's between a nightclub called the Balcony Bar. It consists of 5 office windows. And we use it to display artworks. It's really as simple as that. The name derives from the Greek word, nomad. So nomas, it means roaming in search of pasture. And I say this all the time, but it is very true. Roaming in search of pasture resonated with Owen and I as humans and as artists who are constantly seeking inspiration. And our aim has always been to offer an opportunity to investigate the role of art in society, to engage with ideas, to learn from the experiences of other artists, and to be part of a relevant conversation in the arts in Dundee and beyond. And one of the things since COVID, since we've gone online and done these talks on Zoom, is that we can have people coming from across the UK and even internationally as well, which is amazing. We're delighted to be working with Sarah White. This actually, the Nomas exhibition in the windows, it's been a dual exhibition because Sarah also was working, did a performance in Slessor Gardens in Dundee with Tyrone Isaac Stewart as part of Art Night UK back in June. And I'd written down her art education began, but more her formal higher art education began in Wales in Aberystwyth, at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth, where she completed a BA in Fine Art. That was 2011. And that, I think, was the first time we met. And Sarah was organising an arts conference there, and I attended. I can't remember, Sarah, if that's the first time we met, but that's what I recall.
Maybe at Interface, but yeah.
Perhaps, yeah. And then in 2016, she completed a master's in fine art at Chelsea College of Art in London. And Sarah's now mostly works across performance, installation and writing. One of her writing projects is the Agnosis Journal, which she produces. She's currently studying on the MA, and this is, I think, one of the longest titles of an MA you can get. I thought Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design in Dundee was quite a mouthful, but wait to hear this. She's studying an MA in Creative Practice, dance professional at Trinity Laban Conservative of Music and Dance. Sarah is also the Visual Arts Programme Curator with Morphe Arts, and has worked as a mentor to artists since the charity began in 2012. If you picked up that I worked for Morphe as well, you realise that Sarah and I actually know each other really well. And Sarah might raise the question of why it's taken so long for me to exhibit her work at Nomas, but we won't go into that. So just a bit of background to Sarah's work, and she will elaborate on this, but Sarah's work is rooted in the history of collaborative practice between dance and visual art. As an artist and researcher, she's interested in developing new methodologies of engagement between art theory and practice, philosophy and theology. Her work manifests as installation and performance, utilising a range of processes including movement improvisation, sound, text, casting, woodwork, painting, textiles, and film. Sarah has a background in contemporary dance, and for the past 7 years, her work has been underpinned by a conversation between movement research and visual art practice. So the exhibition for Nomas Projects is called For Some, the Clouds Become Solid Ground. is an installation of relics, memories, and documentation from the performance He Whom You Love Is Absent, that was with Tyrone Isaac Stewart as well. And that was first performed in April this year at the Swiss Church in London. The performance was developed in collaboration with artist duo Gardner and Gardner, and many of the objects in the NOMAS gallery that we're going to see images of were offered into the work by them. I realise that many of you, if you're not based in Dundee, won't have seen the work, so there are some visuals, as Sarah will take us through these. But we're going to hear more about Sarah's practice now, and the particulars of the work that she's made for NOMAS. So as I said, there'll be time for questions. You can put them in the chat as we go. And at the end, obviously, if there's people who have questions, we will just go into discussion from there. So last thing to say, if you can just put your microphone on mute, just so that we don't have any background noises. And please join me in giving Sarah a very warm welcome. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great. Thank you so much for coming. We weren't sure how many people are going to come, so it's very kind. As Kelly said, the installation at NOMAS was a kind of reflection on the process I'd been through over the past year, developing the piece that we performed at the Swiss Church. So I will be talking about the process of developing that work as a way of viewing the installation at NOMAS. The talk will amble through various images and references bound up in this work. It might not be a particularly linear explanation. So alongside the performance, He Whom You Shall Love Is Absent, I published a book of words and scores, which the whole text is online on my website, which you can view. And many of the words in this talk are taken from that book. And that includes drawings from the artist duo Gardner and Gardner. So this is the book, and that's the book at the NOMAS Gallery. It seems like I have been making the same work for the past 4, maybe 6, maybe 8 years. It keeps growing in size, shifting slightly in theme, and moving location. Each time I've performed it with Tyrone Isaac Stewart. The first time I wrote a lecture, which we spoke out loud whilst moving around one another and around an IKEA sofa for 60 minutes. The performance is always improvised. The first time it was about grief, death, absent and present bodies, the incarnation and the resurrection of Jesus, and a response to performance theorist Peggy Phelan's text, Mourning Sex, where she looks at the theme of redemption through Caravaggio's painting of Doubting Thomas, called The Incredulity of St. Thomas, touching the body after death. At the resurrection, Christ's body disappeared from the tomb. In the ascension, his body disappeared again. Christian faith is centered on an incarnated and resurrected God, a God made flesh, yet we cannot touch him now. Faith is in an absent body, which is why it is sometimes so hard to believe, because one longs to touch the body of Jesus as proof and as certainty to the existence of this God in which we believe, in the false illusion that this proof would seize all our doubt. But this is the very faith which Jesus challenges Thomas with. Have you believed because you have seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. In Caravaggio's painting, Thomas plunges his fingers inside Jesus' body, testing the flesh, initiating an opening, finding a gap, entering the cavity, filling the empty space. The wound which Thomas touches is the hole through which we are taken beyond the surface of the painting, into not just a memory, but the embodied reality of the trauma of the crucifixion.
The group asks what kind of body remains after death. What should be done?
I kept seeing falling bodies. In the entombment paintings, Jesus' dead, heavy body falls, the disciples bowing under the weight of the impotent flesh, bones, and organs of the 30-year-old male corpse. To say, I'm feeling down, is an orientational metaphor where we find ourselves literally upside down. In the chapter Whole Wounds in Peggy Phelan's book, Phelan refers to the moment of Jesus' resurrection when Mary, faced with the risen person of her Redeemer, is told, touch me not. Phelan contrasts this refusal of contact to the offer to touch his body, which Jesus extends to Thomas. But the words of Jesus to Mary are not a refusal of physical intimacy, but perhaps more a tender protection towards her. Do not cling to me, for I will be leaving soon. Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended. Do not cling, because I will be leaving again. Mary has to confront not only the resurrected body of her Saviour, but also the knowledge that he will be physically absent again. A double loss, but one which comes with a promise of life. She believed when she saw him, she did not need to touch him for proof of his existence. Her clinging was that of affection, not of assurance. The video in the top left corner here is Pina Bausch's Cafe Miller. It's an extract from YouTube. I was thinking about the character Job in the Old Testament. In his state of questioning and lament, Job articulates how God feels both too near and too far. God is sensed so near and constant in his presence that Job cannot even be alone with his spit. But equally, God is felt so far away and fleeting that he cannot be perceived. He says, "What is man that you make so much of him? Visit him every morning and test him every moment. How long will you not look away from me, nor leave me alone till I swallow my spit?" He also says, "Behold, he passes by me and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him." The question of love is the question of Caravaggio's painting, and is also a question of the Bible as a love story. Do you love me is a question of perspective, of where one is in relation to the other. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Would you die for me? In John's Gospel, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? This repetitive question is a reenactment and recapitulation of Peter's previous threefold denial of Jesus. The trauma of rejecting Jesus is overcome in the repetitive force of assertion in the affirmative, a reversal of the past. I also keep thinking about the dynamics of ascent and descent, of up and down. Once in New York, I attended a place called Dance Space Project, and I saw the famous dancer Yvonne Rainer descend from the balcony. Yvonne Rainer was a dancer in the 60s, and she's now in her 80s. She descended in this godlike manner from the balcony of the church. So that was some kind of fragments of references of images that have kind of I've been carrying with me over the last 4 years, of different characters in scripture, of different encounters with Jesus. This year, I took the fragments from my past performances and research and offered them to new collaborators as impetus to develop a new work together. In November last year, I spent 2 weeks in the studio with Tyrone and dance artist Laura Duella, exploring movement research and improvisation together. The question, how is doubt and faith experienced in the body? And how can improvised movement and sound be a space for encountering the unknown and waiting on God? What is it like to encounter empty space, sensing both the distance and nearness from what or whom we may or may not call God? I should also say that Donna Matthews, who's in the Morphe Network, has had quite a big impact on me with thinking about improvisation. The distance from God can sometimes feel like a profound chasm to which questions are pronounced, but without knowing in which direction spatially to project them. My physical self locates me in space and time and sets boundaries to my experience of the world. Myself is both the limiting and enabling factor between God and I. There is a profound difference between us and God. I cannot touch God. When I pray, do I look up or down or in? Where is God in space and in time? Gregory of Nyssa says, is God located in space or not? If the deity is located above the universe, what is the dividing line between it and the universe? Where is the higher place? How are higher and lower levels to be recognized when there is no dividing line to separate them? In Old Testament encounters, God and man move literally and metaphorically towards and away from one another, or remain in one another's presence. This focus on our bodily orientation highlights the limits and capacities of our body, the profound difference between us and God, the gap or interval in between. So working with Laura, and we took these questions and we created a movement map, a document of movement scores, and an archive of potential impetus from which to move, to speak, and to improvise together, making sense of it all as we go, as words, encounters, and images appear in the space, finding what it is in the space before we enter it, and what we carry in ourselves to bring into that space. Every time we improvised, it added new memories to the archive, which become recalled or recomposted into the next improvisation. This included both contact and solo movement and sound making, a sense of both searching and being present, and all that is in between those four states. What is it to encounter empty space, to encounter your own body, to encounter one another, to encounter the voice? With question and answer, question and question, question and silence, silence and silence. We read some of the movement scores that we found. You see someone fall into empty space, staggering off balance. They thought there was something there, but then there was nothing. There is all this space around you, the space nearby and the space far off. I can enter it with any part of my body. I fall because there is no one there to catch me. How do we enter into other people's space or make space in our own body? Waiting in the silence, finding an anchor, something to stay with, reaching out and following and feeling what it is for the rest of the body to follow. Arms raised, carrying empty space. Holding up your own body. Different sensations of touch. Touching your own body can affirm your shape or can appear frantic. Touch can go in with pressure or slide across the surface of the body, holding and supporting itself. Finding contact between parts of the body, pushing into one another, sliding around, staying with. The body pushing into the body, turning in on itself, struggling, wringing, like the wound, the touch that tries to go in. Something moves you from inside or from the outside, back and forth, getting stuck, bringing the movement back, trying to go forwards. Is this the way forward? What do you do when you don't know where forward is? Do you throw yourself into it? Undoing movement, undoing form, retaking the same pathways, trying to understand them, hesitating. Finding a pulse or rhythm to affirm or to stay with. Being on the edge of yourself. In your vulnerability, does your body ever become someone else's body? Encountering other bodies, giving your center and breathing with. Giving touch and losing it. Touch which slips away. Eyes roaming across the space. Trying to follow but being too late. Looking for God and wrestling in the dark. Struggling with a present, tangible, physical but unseen body. Something passes by you. Encountering the voice, I can speak questions into my own body or send them across space. I ask, do you love me? And the silence replies. I seek the space around me with sound and breath. Letters on the edge of becoming words. So those are some of the kind of movement scores that we developed with Laura, which you can ask more about that if you want. I'm just putting some things in space for now. So then in February, I spent a week with Tyrone and artist duo Gardner and Gardner in residence at the Swiss Church in Covent Garden. So Gardner and Gardner are Heidi Gardner and Peter Gardner, husband and wife duo, based in Glasgow. They came into the space having spent time with my writing, having listened to me speak about my work, and having reflected on the space we were about to inhabit. They came into the space each day with new offerings, with objects, songs, passages of text, and prompts to play with. We began each day singing and praying together in the space. Gardner and Gardner described their work as being created through a long process of consideration, distillation, and paring back, involving contemplation, observation, and the repetition of action. And they are committed to listening as an artistic discipline. Working with them, I felt held and heard. In working with both Laura and Gardner, I experienced what it is like for individuals to listen deeply to your work, to get to know it, and then to offer something back into it. It was a gift to have people invest so much in your practice and commit to getting to know it. So they offered objects into the space. So each day they brought a different object in. The first object was an egg, an empty egg, the whole shell still intact, but the insides had been removed. We held this egg, rolling it, carrying it, gradually pushing the limits of its strength, putting it in my hair, between my toes, rolling it through my fingers, throwing it in the air, testing how far I could throw it. I had this sensation of how far can I push this? How high can I throw this before it breaks? A kind of question of faith, of how far one can push your faith before it cracks. The second object they brought was this elastic, a kind of bungee rope. Heidi and Peter held it between them, wrapped it around their waist, and stretched it across the length of the Swiss church. Tyrone and I stretched it through the room in different directions, crawling on the floor with it around our waist. We stretched it to the door, almost going beyond the door, finding the limits of the stretch and the moment where we are pulled back. The elastic created lines through this empty space, mirroring the meeting of angles and curves throughout the building's architecture, creating a continual line through space between Ty and I, always touching one another. The third object they brought was chalk. We wrote on the floor fragments from the text that I'd written in different directions so that they could be read as we moved, shifting orientation. One time there was bread on the floor. I rubbed the text out with bread, and I wrote, "Bread erases chalk." Our feet and our hands also erased the writing. One evening, we stayed in the building after dusk and improvised in the space in the darkness. Heidi and Peter held the elastic stretched between them and took a slow circular path through the space. I moved through the elastic and through the space. Ty played the saxophone. I began singing the doxology, which is a Christian a refrain that you sing often at the end of worship. This became our evensong. The words, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, you heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost." Ty found the grate in the building floor and sang into it. The sound traveled through the floor and came back up through the other grates around the space. Sound moving underground through the bowels of the building. And I knocked on the walls. And this is the egg, which you can just about see between my toes. And there's egg in there. These aren't the best video. I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare. So I'm going to play the footage, an extracted footage from the performance at the Swiss Church. Key to this work is seeing improvisation as a space of acute attention. The piece we performed was 1.5 hours long and improvised. You have to confront the empty space and the possibility that almost anything could happen. Improvisation requires giving yourself over to something which you do not know and do not fully understand. Christian Jewish philosopher Simone Weil says, "Attention taken to its highest level is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love." She then goes on to say, "The will only controls a few movements of a few muscles. Inner supplication is the only reasonable way for it to avoid stiffening muscles which have nothing to do with the matter. What could be more stupid than to tighten up our muscles and set our jaws about virtue or poetry, or the solution of a problem? Attention is something quite different." Improvisation is an act of heightened attentive responsiveness, a readiness to respond. I define loose scores or structures which we work within and respond to, but there is no choreographed movement. We move slowly, paying attention at each moment to how we are moving and what is possible from where we are. Where is Ty in the space? How fast is he moving? Feeling through the body and in the context of the space and the relationships across it. What do I hear? When do I stay still or silent? How long can I remain there? Continually attending to the present moment, to what is given, to what is at hand, what is accessible. Within structured or scored performance, improvisation we see the theological resonances of a world in which we are continually improvising and always in dialogue with what is available to us at any given moment. All life is a response to what is given and what is at hand, creating a continual dynamic of call and response. We are always responding in some way. The writer Nathan Malading describes the constraints and possibilities within which we find ourselves in this life as the conditions for improvisation, a social practice which is steeped in the past, open to the future, but fully attentive to the present. It says, "This is the world, it exists, I am part of it, it makes demands upon me." In community, affirming the presence of those with you, improvisation is a social practice, hearing a call and responding, saying yes or perhaps no. I've also been attempting to become more aware of where I am in the world, where my weight is, where I am in relation to the ground, and what is possible from where I am. I stand further forwards on my toes, but stability and suspension comes from shifting back. I've been asking how the action of getting in and out of the ground can become a container for exploring my orientation in space, stability, mobility, groundedness, belief, and freedom. Finding ways in and out of the ground seems connected to the stability and instability of spiritual belief or disbelief. Kate Pickering, who's at Goldsmiths University, describes belief and disbelief as a bodily phenomenon. Knowing where the ground is and how my weight is dropping into it at any given moment gives me the understanding of how to push away from it and to find freedom within the glorious constraints of gravity. Losing ground and feeling it shift from under you is disorientating and can be devastating. In August last year, I sort of lost my church community, which I had attended religiously. Don't like that word, sorry. I attended regularly, week in, week out for 8 years as the church closed down in difficult circumstances. For a long time, I shifted each Sunday from church to church with no anchors in any of these places. How do you get back up again? How do you get up when your whole body is heavy and weighs a ton of bricks? How do you get up when the land is shifting under you? How do you keep believing when you have lost the support structures which help sustain that faith? Finding ways in and out of the ground, testing the ground. I have found relief in realizing that physically we are in a continuous state of falling, permanently negotiating instability. We are in constant suspension. Everything inside shifts back to suspend. We are always in a state of falling, suspension as a suspended belief. Belief and disbelief can sometimes exist within the same body at the same time. Faith presupposes doubt. In the movement improvisation in Dundee and Cessa Gardens, I found myself shaking. You can have two sensations within the body simultaneously, your top half shaking and your legs still. The feeling of cold chills in your fingers and heat on your neck, a liquid top and a rhythmic base. So now I'm kind of probably finally talking about the installation at No Mass Gallery. Almost, I mean, I have been talking about it. So thinking about hands and feet, these articulated and pronounced gestures of the hands in particular, but perhaps also the feet, have become recurrent in these improvisations and performance, pointing at myself, at others, into space, pointing and pressing into various parts of the body, holding and balancing eggs and elastic, writing with chalk on the ground. In historical religious paintings, artists attempt to manifest the appearances of God, angels, or spiritual beings as they break forth into the dimensions of the aesthetic world we know. How do you visualize and paint the spiritual meeting the material? Are they different? How do we visualize that which we cannot see? Is the heavenly world made of the same matter as the earthly? Are heaven and earth in the same place, just out of sight of one another? Angels cross through the skies of firmament and become solid forms, or appear through a wall, entering from a realm outside of the painting. We witness this in Giotto's paintings of Joachim's dream, Joachim's sacrifice, and the announcement to Anna, which T.J. Clark talks about in the book Heaven on Earth. The apparition of an angel to Joachim whilst he is sleeping. The apparition of an angel to Joachim whilst he is sleeping. The appearance of a hand from heaven hovering over the burnt sacrifice, and the half body of the angel squeezing through the window into Anna's room. So this one, and this hand up here. The hand and the body are dissected, cut through and cut off from the rest of themselves. In these paintings, the apparitions appear through this blue backdrop. As T.J. Clark says, the angel is the blue incarnate, emerging from it incompletely, articulating it, absorbing the monad's whole power. The angel is in his state of half coming into being, with the tails of his garment as fading brushstrokes. Joachim is out in the wilderness, crawling and praying across the desert rocks. It is a particular staging of the relation between heaven and earth. The hand is a familiar form that opens out onto another dimension, putting the world as we know it into doubt. Those are quotes from T.J. Clark. These painted apparitions articulate our negotiation of that which we cannot see, but yet strive to believe. Are these hands and feet real? Giotto's spiritual beings are real but miraculous. The handling of paint, of transparency and opaqueness, are Giotto's way of reflecting on God's creation, on reality and its discontinuities. So these are, again, finally, some stills from the Nomas exhibition. Bodily metaphors are applied continually across Hebraic scripture to human life, death, and morality, to Yahweh's actions and character, to the behavior and fate of the land, and to the interactions between all of these entities. God is ascribed, amongst other features, a mouth, fingers, hands, and eyes which roam to and fro across the earth, yet also people see no form pertaining to him. These images are both given and withdrawn. This bodily language pertains not only to Yahweh, but also to creation itself. In Genesis 1, in the beginning is Reshith in Hebrew, which comes from the root word rosh, meaning head. How does God appear? Resonating in fire, wind, smoke, thunder, light, flesh, touch, reverberations, and manifestations. God manifests in smoke, wind, and fire. These clay hands and feet are both memories of moments from the performance and reflections on the bodily appearances of Yahweh in the Old Testament and the painterly manifestations of these bodies. As I reflect on the distance between us and God and the difficulty of belief, we are also faced with the God-made flesh story and the meeting place of this ontological impossibility. The very doctrine of the resurrection confounds and radically alters the optics of vision. The spectacle of the resurrection was not a spectacle at all, It's a series of intimate personal encounters between bodies. These encounters were essentially evocative in their manifestation of touch, sight, sound, and taste. Encounters with the very particular body of Jesus. And finally, this was the last window on the corner of the NOMAS gallery. So after the performance that I did at the Swiss church, a friend came up to us and said, was this performance based on this painting, which is by Piero della Francesca? And I said, no, it wasn't. I've never seen that painting before. But the painting had this egg, the egg hanging from the shell, with this falling Christ baby figure, and the arch, just the proscenium kind of arch was really similar to the Swiss church space that we were in. So I made a cardboard replica of that piece, with the egg hanging. Yeah, I'm just going to end there. Show the last picture there. That was an ode to my friend Brett, who saw the link of the painting. Thank you,
Sarah. It's interesting you've left us hanging there just with that that connection. You know, that there was the painting, the Swiss church, the egg, all that coming together. It was amazing. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your just sharing kind of so openly a sense of, I think, vulnerability as well. You know, obviously you're talking, it seems, a lot about faith. I think probably the most explicit talk we've ever had at NOMAS, where someone's sharing in the way that you have been, and clearly wrestling with faith, wrestling with humanity, you know, what it means to be human, the physicality, the interaction with others as well. So just really appreciate that. I'm glad this has been recorded though, because I feel like I need to listen over again, because there's a lot in there, and maybe other people are feeling this too. You know, in terms of discussions around theology, discussions around movement and the understanding of that, discussions around improvisation. There's just a lot. You know, when you said you've been kind of working through this probably for the last 4 years, and I think that rigor. And that research is really, really showing out. So I really appreciate that, Sarah, but also just you sharing, you know, what is obviously this kind of personal working out going on in your own life as well. So really appreciate that. One thing that struck me, Sarah, was, you know, obviously the sense of wrestling. And when I was watching the rehearsal in the Chisenhale studios, it was with Tyrone and the other lady, I can't remember her name.
Laura.
Nara? Laura, yeah. And there was just a bit where they were kind of, their arms were going in and out, and it just brought a smile to my face. And as much as all, you know, there's a kind of struggle sense in the way that you're working things out, but I wonder where that connects with joy, you know, in the sense of, do you feel, you know, when you're working with someone else or really connecting on an improvisation, that there's also that sense of joy? Do you experience that in amongst the struggle when you're working with other people? That's my question.
That's a good question. My first thought is like humor is something that I'm trying to work out, because I think improvisation, there's often moments that are humorous either to the audience because of like the angle of an image, because it's often in the round, in the way that a particular gesture might appear to people, things can feel humorous, and there's this kind of disconnect with wanting to laugh sometimes, or even for myself when something happens that you is unexpected, and yeah, holding that kind of humor in a space which is very silent and still.
Yeah.
But also, with with both of the performances, the kind of ecstatic sensation of something happening, which is just what joyful is. think Donna would talk about that kind of ecstatic moment in improvisation of encounter with God. That is something that I've only started to notice recently. The piece at the Swiss church was the first time almost like I felt God speaking to me. I don't know if that's, I know, like that there was a kind of a delight or a joy of, and because it was such a long period of time, you have space to go through all of those emotions. I guess like with an hour and a half improvisation, that there's periods of really long stillness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not just all wrestling, but all of that kind of wrestling is underneath. It's the kind of like soil on which all of the performance then happens. And then you have that kind of moment where there's stillness, waiting, ecstasy, confusion, not knowing what to do next. Yeah.
It's to me, it sounds quite, and I think maybe you described this, it sounds quite, well, I was going to say painful, but I don't think painful is the right word, but something where you're just putting yourself, there's a bit when you were showing the video excerpt from the Swiss church where you talked about when you give yourself over to improvisation, you're just so vulnerable, and it sounds, because it could be ecstasy, but it could be pain, it's whatever's going to come. And I think that's what makes the work feel so powerful. You're watching someone really wrestling through something. To me, that's what it looks like to me. Martine, you have your hand up. Do you want to open up your mic? Yeah.
I just want to thank you for your presentation. For me, it's interesting you just said pain, because that was my response to your work. It's like a call for me to risk being more intimate with God, because to me, touch and intimacy are very close together. And something about all the truth you said, it just is like a call for me to risk the messiness of it, of coming closer and risking. Because, I think touch goes both ways, and I think God has ways of touching us that mimic, physical touch. So thank you. I just felt that call to be more risk more in terms of knowing him and letting him know me.
Thank you, Martine. There's a question here from Dan Drage. He says, thanks, Sarah, so much going on here. And that's definitely true. I wonder, with your awareness of materials in the material world, whether place plays a role in your work. In a direct sense, it obviously does, but I wonder how you think about place as an element of your work. Are you able to answer that, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I mean, the work is completely dependent on the space. It changes everything, I think. Because Cuddy said, can you come and do the Swiss church piece in Dundee? And we were like, no, like it doesn't work. Like, as in that in Dundee, we were performing in a public garden outside. There was at nighttime. The condition, every condition was completely different of people's concentration, of the acoustics of the space, of the scale of the space, of people not being there for us, being there to have a nice time in the park. Every condition was different. And so we could kind of take the archive, but we had to sit in a space for a few days to work out what would make sense there. And the same with the Swiss church. I think Gardner and Gardner are very sensitive to the space that they're in. And so most days we were the kind of singing in the space. You understand the acoustics of what you're doing. We improvise like multiple times a day for a week in that space. And so you discover the space, you find the grates in the floor, you find the sound when you knock on the walls, you see all the mirror. There's lots of mirrors in the Swiss church, and these kind of curves meeting angles in the architecture, which Heidi and Peter talked about, is obviously a church space. It changes everything.
I can testify to Sarah's struggle when she came to Dundee and found the space at Slessor Gardens, and tried to work out with Ty, okay, how are we going to work in this space? What transfers, from the Swiss church interior to basically outside in the public garden. What was interesting is the conversation and the partnership with Gardner and Gardner helped to resonate, where they drew a big chalk circle right in the middle of the path, and that helped to, to contain them, or at least if they broke out of that, there was something to break out of. And, that idea of collaboration is a big part of your work as well, Sarah. I see there's other questions, but just on the collaboration, you obviously work with Ty quite a lot, and obviously you've worked with Gardner and Gardner. Is that, like, going forward, are you thinking it would be better to work with people who already know your work, or do you feel going forward, the thought of working with more people, different people?
I think I've always collaborated with people. I think it opens up your capacity for understanding what is possible. I think, I almost always work in community. I think in some ways I'm quite interested in what it is to make work just by myself. With the masters at Lab, and I've had the space to do that a bit, which is more of a challenge to me. Yeah. Should I respond to some of those questions in there?
Yeah, if you just take Janet's question first, I think that might be the most simple one. What was the inspiration for the change of title in Dundee?
I didn't see that question. I think it relates back to what Dan was saying, that when I say I've been making the same work for 4 or 5 years, I think the change of title is about the space. I think the work changes is a different work in each space, and so the title changes because it's a different work. Because the space is everything.
Owen's question then: how has it changed your attitude to control and risk by choosing improvisation and then the artifacts of performance as a legacy? Because obviously, for Nomas, it became almost physical artifacts, and that was quite different from your performing work, isn't it?
Yeah, I found that quite uncomfortable. Because my background's fine art, so I do work with materials, and I have done in the past, but I've spent the last few years with performance, and so going back to objects was quite difficult, and making sense of that in a static form. I guess it became more about these religious images which I think I've carried with me throughout, of like an image of Jesus, of Thomas or Mary or Peter or Job, and these kind of pictures of but I wanted to spend more time with that question at the end about the materials metamorphosizing between kind of the spiritual and the earthly. Not that I see those two things as distinct, but I would have had more time to play with that.
I think you did it really well, Sarah. It was interesting because I think I had forgotten, that your background was in fine art as well. Even the MA at Chelsea, so going back to Aberystwyth and then the MA at Chelsea. So when you sent me the images of Progress with the clay feet and hands, I was so shocked. And then obviously you brought together the different artifacts and the chalk and so on and all that. It didn't feel like a documentation. It felt like a new work in response to what you'd done before with the artifacts. And I thought that was the strength of it. It didn't feel like, oh, here's the documentation of what we did. So I think that was great. Just when you mentioned different artists as well, so there's a question there from Chris Miller. Says, thanks, Sarah. The Caravaggio means a lot to me also, but about disablement, God, and the resurrected body. Does this resonate with your work?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. I guess I've thought about the idea of the wounds of Christ carrying forth into the new creation, like in the resurrected body, that those marks of the body which has been injured are still present in the new creation, and that feels really important. And it's not quite I don't know if it's kind of connected, but I've been reading John Hull's book. In the beginning, there was darkness. John Hull, the theologian. I think Chris, you recommended him to me, or I'm not quite sure. His film Notes on Blindness, we're talking about the theology of darkness and of light, and how he wrestles with that as a man who is blind, or wrestled with that. So yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a lot recently, the last few weeks, of faith as of faith and sight, and like we live by faith, not by sight. That kind of things that we can't see, and that maybe blindness tells us something different about faith that we, as me as a sighted person, don't understand.
Thanks, Sarah. There's a question here from Matthew. The elastic lines made in the space reminded me of the invisible thread given by great grandma Irene to little Irene in George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, which is one of my favourite images of faith. Actually, that's from Iona. Am I saying that right, Iona? Yeah. And that's just a comment, but interesting how, I mean, that's the thing, obviously objects and movement and stuff that can resonate with other people in terms of what they've seen, their memories and so on. And then another observation, not a question, from Heather. I was wondering about why the hand with the egg displayed in the window looked familiar. Then, as Cully mentioned, metamorphosis, I realised it was the Dali picture of metamorphosis. Were you aware of that, Sarah? Yeah.
If I say no, does that sound really bad?
No, because it's like with the egg, finding that painting with the egg.
I mean, now that you've said it, I'm like, yeah, of course, that makes total sense. Yeah.
I like how those connections. That's the thing, because when we've either by osmosis have learned something, we've picked it up, we're responding. And it is completely unique to us, but it's all within the context of a world that's already where things are already out there as well. And I love how these things connect, even when we don't realise. I
mean, thinking, because obviously Chris Miller's here, but I think with Chris's background of art history, that when you've talked about your work, like something happens in your life and you think of a painting, and you're like, oh, that moment was like that painting, and that kind of was a really amazing way of working when you have that kind of library of images in your imagination that you then read your life in terms of art history, or not read it, but you can read parts of your life in terms of a painting or an image or a painting.
And things change symbolically as well, don't they? Do you know what the symbolism of the egg was in the Francesca Piera del Francesca painting was? Do we know what? I mean,
there's images of birth and of so I think the shell is supposedly a symbol of the new Venus, of the idea of Mary. There's references to the virgin conception.
Yeah. Okay, over to you, Owen.
Thanks, Cully, and thanks, Sarah, so much for sharing your work. As always, we really deeply appreciate it. And I think it's possibly one of the most complex pieces that we've been part of as NOMAS. And for me, it was amazing to watch people quieten down as Tyrone and yourself were working in this space. It's Lesser Gardens, and for people to enter in. Some were laughing and drinking, and others were quite sort of suddenly moved and sort of settled down. It was almost like a religious thing for them in a very kind of secular environment. I was very struck by that as somebody just being there observing you guys performing. Of course, we just wanted to show some photos which have already been seen of the space, and it's such a complicated thing to convey, but I think you've done an amazing job today of trying to explain where this work comes from. And for us, it's a privilege to be part of that kind of snapshot in time over those number of years that you've been wrestling with these thoughts. And this piece, I was very struck by this as well, and the kind of almost the theatricality of it and the control of it, and then the art history reference there too. for me, I've always understood the shell, the scallop, as a kind of sign of pilgrimage, and the vulnerability. So when I saw the egg and the scallop, I was thinking of just the kind of fragility of life, in particular, with with the drawings there in the maquette. So it looks lovely. And these pieces too, it just draws people in. And I love the surrealist nature of it. And I think as well that kind of struggle of faith even just speaks into the Dali reference that came up in the conversation. And the kind of Jungian idea of the subconscious or the unconscious. It seems to carry all the way through a certain reading of art history as well. And it's hard to convey how people were responding as we were filming you, but it was quite amazing to watch the crowd. And I'm not sure how aware of that you were because you guys were in that moment when you were performing with Peter there in the background, holding the line, so to speak. And I was very struck by Simone Weil's remark that we must not wish for the disappearance of our troubles, but for the grace to transform them. And for me as an artist, I always want that to be in that kind of good space or that strong or solid space. But listening to you today made me think that I actually know the kind of the vulnerability that comes across in your work is the thing that is the kind of reality in which we work. And maybe that's where the mining comes from. Maybe that's where the resonance of the work comes from. And then in a conversation with a friend that's a counsellor, he mentioned Brene Brown to me recently, and she wrote, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity." And I was very struck about that when you were sharing the kind of background to your work today. So we're very grateful for you to have been so vulnerable. The whole piece speaks of that to me. I look at it. And thank you very much for your time today. We're really grateful for people joining us from across the world to hear Sarah's show. So big thanks to Sarah and a big thanks to yourselves.
Yeah,